Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tracy Cook, and I'm the online media manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled The Business Analyst Catalyst, the role of the BA in today's business world. Today's featured speaker is Mike Brusky, the senior instructor at 2080 Strategy Execution. Today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. Please be sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions features of the GoToWebinar software. And I'd like to say thank you to 2080 Strategy Execution for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I will turn it over to Anne from 2080 Strategy Execution to say a few words before we get started. Anne?
Thank you, Tracy. Hello and good day, everyone. My name is Anne Runyon, and I am 2080 Strategy Execution's Director of Commercial Marketing. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome everyone here today. Prior to introducing our accomplished speaker, I would like to take a brief moment to introduce 2080 Strategy Execution, formerly IPS Learning and ESI International. Over the past 3 decades of client successes and nearly 3 million professionals trained, we have established ourselves as a global leader in project-focused learning solutions. We offer foundational through advanced curriculum and certification opportunities in conjunction with our renowned educational partners for the disciplines of project, program, and portfolio management, business analysis, contract and vendor management, agile, and project leadership skills. Strategy Execution's best-in-class content, tenured instructors with practical experience, and a full breadth of training modalities to align with learning preferences, budget, and availability allow us to truly move the needle for our students. To learn more about how we can advance your individual career or to enhance project performance within your organization, visit our website at strategyex.com, or for your convenience, we have an attached handout that you can download from the GoToWebinar control panel. Today, we are absolutely thrilled to highlight one of Strategy Execution's senior instructors to present. Mike Brusky is a senior trainer and a principal consultant for TBA&P LLC, with more than 30 years of experience providing strategic planning, comprehensive business analysis, and complex program and project management coaching to Fortune 500 firms, small, fast-growing companies, and entrepreneurs alike, all across the globe and across a very diverse set of commercial industries and government. He has led multi-million-dollar projects, expanded market performance, designed financial decision models, created new service new concepts, led crisis reaction teams, and established both PMOs and BA and PM centers of excellence. He has published 2 books, authored a multitude of articles, and can be found presenting at global conferences and events. We are absolutely thrilled to have him share his intriguing insights with the group. So without further ado, it's my sincere pleasure to turn the session over to your presenter. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne. I'd like to also extend my personal welcome to everyone and hope that your interest in this webinar was at least partially sparked by the title, The Business Analyst Catalyst, because the premise of this session is really that the function of business analysis and the role of the BA have been evolving to the point where they're more than ever recognized as key ingredients for both optimizing success on the one hand and minimizing risk on the other. So as we go through the next 45 minutes, we are hoping that at the very least we spark some new ideas and insights for you and also give you something to think about in terms of how to package and clarify your roles in the overall organization, starting with the sponsors at the top all the way through the individuals on the specific project teams. We've divided the discussion and presentation into 3 parts: the context of business analysis, the role of the BA, and then the application of business analysis within the context and as part of that role. In order to set the stage for the context, we're going to start by just stepping back and taking kind of a ground level approach to talking about what goes on in organizations, and we characterize that as how dreams become reality. The obvious first step in an enterprise is to define the mission, which is why it exists, and the vision, which is where it wants to go. After that, time gets specific to determine when we're going to achieve the mission and vision, and along the way, what are the particular milestones that we will be striving for. As we get into this, the programs and the projects become the how. And this is the process for how operations, the day-to-day activities of any enterprise, whether it's commercial, government, not-for-profit, ends up either becoming more capable of doing something, which means that we create something that wasn't there before, or we fix something that was broken, that along the way was very, very important. Now, the top four elements of mission, vision, goals, and objectives clearly comprise the strategy. The prioritization of which programs and projects come into play are determined by the goals and objectives, setting criteria that allow us to evaluate each program and project against those criteria and say, this needs to be done, this does not need to be done. And the result of this is a portfolio, or an inventory of all the approved, funded, and supported programs and projects in terms of staffing, funding, and time. Now, where does the BA come into all of this? Well, the BA comes in because the deliverables at the project level contribute to the overall outcomes of the programs, and that link, that trace, needs to be there. Those outcomes, in turn, promote the benefits that achieve the objectives, and achievement of the objectives, again, results in capabilities delivered into operations that simply did not exist before. So the traceability provided by comprehensive business analysis is what allows this particular concept, this particular orientation of business analysis to achieve some degree of success. Now, we're going to focus on the business analysis now in a bit of a more professional context and talk about what we have in mind as the enterprise triple constraint. Many of you, if not most, are familiar with PMI's triple constraint of scope, schedule, and resources, and what we've done is broadened that to apply to an enterprise as a whole rather than just to a project or a program. So the concept starts with the idea of strategic planning. The fact that unless we have a direction to go in, it's very, very difficult to determine whether or not we've made any progress. But as in the prior slide showing how dreams become reality, that strategic planning needs to be distilled into actionable scope. And that's where the business analysis comes into play. Once that has been accomplished professionally and we now have clarity around scope, now we can entertain the idea of program and project management that will take us into the operational environment. All three of these elements are absolutely critical for success, and that is the fundamental concept of our presentation this afternoon. Without strategic planning, BA and PM simply float without any guidance that shows where they should be or any measurement of progress along the way. Without business analysis, transforming strategy into actionable scope becomes very, very iffy. Trial and error. And I would expect that just about everyone on the line today would agree that that's very risky and expensive. It's similar to the age-old concept of ready, fire, aim instead of ready, aim, fire. And we've all gone through that. And then, of course, once the strategic planning and business analysis are accomplished, if the project management is not at a professional level, in other words, if it's just a sort of an added duty to someone who's already got a lot to do, then, of course, that's unfortunate because the discipline of project management is what helps the business analysis and the resulting scope become operational excellence. So we take the idea of the enterprise triple constraint and we start with the strategic planning. And here we see some of the classic artifacts and concepts that determine strategic planning, starting with the business case and then proceeding into or including a cost-benefit analysis and a capabilities roadmap, some sort of an indication as to how we're going to become better along the line. and of course the priorities at the strategic level, which are used to determine which programs and which projects come into being. Now I'm going to pause here just a second in case any of you are saying, well, you know, this is a business analysis webinar and we're talking about a lot of high-level enterprise and strategic stuff. Well, I'm going to ask you to just bear with me because the concept of the enterprise triple constraint shows how each of these three sides of the equilateral triangle are absolutely essential. And if we acknowledge that, we can now get into the discussion of business analysis as the next step. So once we have the mission, vision, goals, and objectives, now we need to translate that into actionable, measurable needs and scope. And we do that in ways that should look very familiar, starting by planning out our requirements, doing very high-level enterprise analysis that proceeds from the top level there, strategic planning, and all of the other elements that go into business analysis, ever gradually ratcheting into more precise and measurable elements, including the functional and non-functional requirements, transition requirements, and the ultimate deliverable or the primary deliverable of the BA, the business requirements document. Now, once we've got that behind us, now and only now, are we ready to get into the program and project management element, because now we have the scope and we can start building the schedule, the budget, the quality, and manage the risk and deliverables that are intended to come out of this particular initiative. And as this is conducted, of course, the project manager, in conjunction with both the business analyst and the sponsors and senior decision makers, create those elements that are so essential for success, starting with a great charter and or statement of work, clear roles and responsibilities, and all of the other elements we show here, assumptions, constraints, and so on. And again, the role that the business analyst can play in this is so fundamental to success, because without the precision and the discipline and the breadth of what the business analyst can do in terms of clarifying scope, helping with the assumptions, helping with the idea of testing and training, then without that, the project manager is left with gaps, and gaps create uncertainty, and uncertainty is simply a synonym for risk. So when we put all of this together, what we have then is the enterprise triple constraint that says exactly what we started with. Without strategic planning and that key direction with the priorities and the intended or desired capabilities, we are going to be just floating. If we don't do the business analysis and go right from the strategic objectives to the project or program, as we've seen so many times and continue to see in modern business, then without that, we are simply guessing. With business analysis, all of the things that we create, especially the gap analysis, the difference between where we are now and where we will be in the future, ends up being an element of bridging the strategic objective to the implementation plan. And of course, to the extent that the business analysis is completed in a professional and thoroughgoing manner, then the project and program management likelihoods for success just zooms. All right, so that's the context of business analysis. Now let's talk about the role of the BA. And we're going to do that by taking each of the aspects that we've seen so far and talk about how does the BA play a role in that. Because let's face it, the business analysis profession is still evolving, and it's come a long way than where it was about 20 years ago when I first got into it. Now it's seen as more than just a very high-level administrative task into one that contributes to insights and decision-making. So the role of the BA has become much, much more professional and recognized. Still has a long way to go in my estimation, but it's done a lot of progress. So let's talk about the strategy analysis part of this. Where does the BA get involved up front? Well, up top we see the context that we talked about earlier, the mission, vision, goals, and objectives. And if we're in the enterprise strategy layer, the idea is that the fulfillment of strategy is all of the things that we list here. We have portfolios or inventories of initiatives, whether they're called projects or programs. We have elements of risk. We have expenditures, whether they're investments or people. And we have indexes that we need to abide by and follow. The idea of taking these from the highest level decision makers' concepts into measurable, precise elements that can be translated into scope down the road is an essential contribution that the business analyst makes. Now, after that stage is done, now we get into what has been traditionally associated with BA as its primary role, namely requirements analysis. Now, again, the context of requirements is the business architecture as well as the business and user requirements. And we all know the difference between requirements and desires or wants. So the BA is here in his or her sweet spot in trying to separate what people would like from what things actually support strategic objectives and goals. So in the requirements area, we see the very familiar functional, non-functional requirements and the beginning of solution identification. Now, we know as BAs, we do not propose or request particular solutions, but we also know that our role is to collect and assemble enough information so that solution alternatives can be very properly and productively compared to each other. So the idea of requirements analysis, once again, is very, very familiar and very central to our role. Now when we get into the project management stage, when we're talking about taking all of these requirements and this refined scope and doing something with it, now is when the project manager, supported by us, gets into the resources, the schedule, quality, and risk in order to now outline the deliverables. Because up until now, what we've talked about is what needs to be done. Now we get into how is it going to be done and what's it going to look like when it is. And all of the elements here, including the testing and the training. The final element is the transition analysis, and this is an area that the International Institute of Business Analysis has in the last few years provided more and more emphasis and focus on. The idea that the BA can contribute significantly to things like helping operations identify necessary skills and perhaps necessary staff. What kind of warranty makes sense in terms of what the BA knows to be the needs both at the executive and at the operational level. So when we get through all of these four building blocks, what we end up with is a better understanding of the continuum in which the business analyst exists. The idea that the BA is not simply relegated or limited to the requirements analysis, but is very, very valuable and should be more and more involved in and used for the strategy analysis, as well as being a partner through the solution evaluation and the post-project or post-program transition analysis. Now, let's take a quick look at how this kind of fits into a normal...
Hey, Mike, sorry, I have a quick question.
Yes, yes.
All right, one of our audience members asked, is this triangle application for all sizes of business? So small, medium, and large companies.
Say that again because the first part kind of broke up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mike. Is this triangle application for all sizes of business?
Absolutely, absolutely. And here's the reason I would say that with such, let me go back to it too, with such emphasis. Let's take a look at this and you ask yourself which part would you drop. And here's an example I like to use because this, I think, brings it kind of home as to whether it's scalable or not. Let's say you want to go on a vacation with your family. All right, so it's Saturday morning and you wake everyone up and say, let's go, we're going on vacation. And everybody says, well, wait a minute, where are we going? Not sure yet, but we're going to have fun. Well, what should we bring? Anything you want. How long will we be gone? Until we stop having fun. I would be willing to bet that so far no one has actually embarked on that kind of a vacation, or at least not more than once. If that's the case, and if something as simple as taking the family on a vacation says, well, let's do a little strategic planning. Let's talk about, who's going to need to take time off at work. Do I need to take some money out of the savings account? Do I need to get the car checked out if we're going to drive so everything's working properly? Okay, that's strategic planning. How about the business analysis? Where do we want to stay? Do we want to stay at a resort where all sorts of things can be enjoyed, or do we just want to stay at a motel so we can get going the next day? And then, of course, the project program management means along the way, how are we doing? We're watching the gas gauge. We're watching our checkbook. We're trying to make sure that we have all the fun we can within the budget and the time frame that we have. So with that analogy in mind, hopefully the idea of this triangle comes into play. Now, a little later on, I'm going to talk about the concept of waterfall traditional project management versus recursive or iterative agile Scrum project management, in the context of all of this applying the same way, but perhaps not to the same intensity. So do you need a business case, cost-benefit analysis, and capabilities roadmap if you're a small company of 12 and you're basically creating products every 6 months? Maybe not, but you might not call it that. You're still going to do it. You're still going to come up with an analysis, some sort of evaluation of what the competition in the marketplace is doing. And you don't even need to call it strategic planning. You can just call a forward look. But the idea is that all three of these apply no matter what. You just have to be judicious in how intense and how comprehensive it is, because what we don't want to do is build a bureaucracy around this. We want this to be a catalyst. Now, I always like to ask after answering a question whether I succeeded in doing it. So did that come close to doing it?
Mike, I thought that was a great answer. I haven't received anything from the attendance member, but it sounded great to me. Yes, and thank you.
You're welcome. Just wanted to check. Okay, so as I started to say here, after we get through the building blocks, if you will, of strategy execution and the role that the BA can and should play from the beginning to end, that's kind of, high level. Let's take a look in the weeds here and take a look at how it really happens. So what we've done is we've divided the activity of a project or a program into two layers. So we take the strategy layer, which we call the business domain, and that's where all of the things you see here, mission, vision, and various goals exist. Then we come to the requirements and planning layer, which we call the project and could be the program domain. And that's where you'll see the familiar down on the ground type of activities, the charter, the business requirements document, and a project statement of work or a scope statement. Then, after all of that is completed and the project has executed its deliverables and the program has achieved its outcomes and benefits, it's transitioned to the action or operations domain, and that is where the organization truly realizes its achievement of objectives. And in the middle of all of this is business analysis. So if you take that out of this diagram here, what you're left with is going from goals to project to implementation. That's like going on vacation without a map, a tank full of gas, or money in your checkbook. It just really doesn't make sense. Now, one of the things that this does too is it sets the stage for us to do portfolio management. Now, portfolio management is a concept that is not necessarily uniformly understood, but I think generally understood. The idea is that with portfolio management, we want some sort of an intake process. That is, of all of the proposed initiatives, whether they're projects or programs that individuals and departments in an organization would like to have funded and supported, we can't do it all. So the intake process says we're going to have a prioritization system, specific criteria that say whether or not your initiative that you're proposing meets them. We're also going to determine what the benefit or outcome of your particular initiative would be. In other words, what's it going to do for our strategic objectives? How is it interdependent or related to others? And is it traceable? Is it traceable to one or more strategic objectives? Now, when we do this, And if we acknowledge that portfolio management applies to all the potential or discretionary activities that we could undertake, the business analyst comes into play not only in helping in these areas, but helping us answer 4 very important questions. Number 1, what projects and programs are we working on compared to number 2, which ones should we be working on? The BA's role and contribution here can be in the area of the prioritization criteria, which we'll look at in a moment, developing them for the decision makers, and in helping identify the metrics for the benefits and outcomes. The idea that there will be specific units of measure as much as possible to determine whether the before is being improved by the after. The next question is, do any of the projects relate to each other such that they should constitute a single program, or should they be managed individually and in a segregated fashion? Because there are all sorts of analytical and analysis elements that come into play, like economies of scale, that the business analyst can contribute to in trying to determine the best portfolio structure. And the final thing is every project in the portfolio supporting one or more strategic goals? That's the traceability we saw at the very beginning of the presentation, to say, well, you know, if we're doing this, there's got to be a reason. And if I don't know what that reason is, if the program or project manager cannot cite which strategic objective is being supported, then it's a legitimate cause for a timeout to say, why are we doing this? And the BA should be able to come in and help determine whether their traceability is there or not. Now, I mentioned the concept of prioritization, and here we have an idea or a portrayal of prioritization that certainly I have found works very well. And if we look at this, it's straightforward in the sense that it covers the things that are important to a business. So we start first with this column that talks about what is the name of the initiative. All right, is it a program with several projects, or is it a standalone project? Next, the strategic goal alignment. How many strategic goals are there, and how does a particular project or program align with those strategic goals, high, medium, or low? Then, what is the capital? The capacity here talks about capital in terms of investment. It talks about non-labor and labor expenditures. How are those? What level are they? And what is the projected risk level? Obviously, when we talk about high, medium, and low risk, that has to be defined. But in this summary here, it says that you're either high, medium, or low, and you're given that designation. What is the index by which the organization would make a selection of a project or program? Is it return on investment? Is it payback period? Is it net present value? Any of those. What is the time frame? Is it near term or not? And I will be honest with you, I have used this in organizations with hundreds of initiatives. And I call them initiatives because not until they were processed through this analysis, this analytical tool, were they determined to be legitimate projects or programs that would gain support. Because let's face it, in this hypothetical example, I say Project 1 supports 4 of the strategic goals in a high fashion. Well, that clearly indicates that it's much more intensely aligned with the organization's future than this project down here that supports none of them in the high element. So again, the idea here is that the BA does not need to be limited and should not be limited to only the domain of the project or the program in terms of business analysis. The analysis that we provide can have an immense value for the organization as a whole. Now, if we look again at the enterprise triple constraint and the question that came up earlier about, does this apply to all sizes of activities? Well, as we see here, the idea is yes, it does. And one of the ways to address scalability is the concept of recursive or iterative agile Scrum project management, which begs the question, okay, what about it? How does it apply there? Well, let's take a look at waterfall first. Here we have the enterprise triple constraint, which again is the triangle designated to optimize the likelihood that we will go into operations successfully, giving operational capabilities that we never had before, or fixing something that's broken and now is no longer a liability. When we transition from the end of the project to the post-implementation, that is where the strategy becomes reality. And one of the phrases used to describe this is the concept of the Big Bang. In other words, we go live on a particular date, and all of the months or quarters or years that led up to it now culminate in that one transition. Well, if we look at this in the concept of Agile and Scrum, where thinner slices of scope are put into play, each of these has a particular event where strategy becomes reality. It's just not the entire strategy. The entire strategy becomes reality after the final iteration. And one of the ways that I like to compare these two approaches is that NASA would not typically take a recursive or iterative approach to project management if it involved, for instance, a mission to Mars, which has occupied so much of news and TV lately. But on the other hand, when we're putting things like smartphones out there, clearly, if the smartphone industry had waited until now to give us all of the applications that we have, all of the myriad capabilities we have, that would have been a shame. Because along the way, with these incremental deliveries, we have seen all sorts of capabilities that we did not have before. And each of these triangles became an element or an event where strategy became reality. So the idea of the enterprise triple constraint and the importance of business analysis is as applicable to waterfall, traditional project management, as it is to Agile Scrum. Those of us who have been involved in both know that there are terminology differences. We apply use case modeling in traditional and user stories in Agile. We do a work breakdown structure of a detailed nature in a traditional project, and we do a features list or a velocity diagram or a particular release schedule in the world of Agile and Scrum. But the fundamental importance is that all of the business analysis that goes into traditional planning goes into Agile and Scrum only on a smaller slice of scope. And of course, the Scale Agile Framework, or SAFE, that has evolved over the past few years basically emphasizes that. The concept, as we see here, that when you take an organization, either at the program or enterprise level, there's nothing that says you can't have iterative, Agile, or Scrum type approaches when you're putting things together, because that will still contribute to the mosaic of capabilities that the organization will have as a whole. The important thing is that nowhere along the way do we sacrifice the type of discipline and insight that business analysis contributes. All right, so with all of this...
Mike, we just have a question. Margot asks, what's the reason for not including the change management plan in the triangle?
Change management is like quality and risk management. It applies throughout. And in fact, if that's not there, then it should be at least as an element on the, let me take a look at an earlier slide. No, I mean, that could easily be added because change management needs to apply to all three elements. Certainly, sometimes strategy changes, and that needs to be reflected in an updated business case. Obviously, business requirements change as they evolve and everyone gets more and more precise, so change management applies there. And of course, change management is a fundamental pillar of project management. So it absolutely applies. There are other elements too, like communication management and whatnot, that apply throughout the enterprise triple constraint, just not listed for space reasons more than anything else.
Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome. Hopefully that did answer it, because change management is absolutely critical for requirements management in the BA world, as well as business case and project management. Now, one of the things that we like to entertain here is the concept of evaluating our organizations in terms of how they measure up. So in this particular questionnaire, if you will, that we've developed, there's 5 parts. The first one talks about whether or not you have a strategic planning process. Does it have a specific mission, vision, and are goals supported? Then, does each project have a formal charter? Much to my amazement, charters are not as universal as they should be. And the charter should contain, obviously, the scope, the initial budget estimate, and a preliminary milestone. I characterize the charter as a birth certificate, so it's not very precise at the beginning any more than the birth certificate of a child is, but it needs to be there so we know exactly what we're starting out with. Now, here is where we come into our part. Business requirements. Are they formally documented and validated? Are they approved by the key stakeholders? And are they easy to find for review and update? Now, once we get past that, we get into the structure, like the PMO concept, and the transition process. And what we see here is just an example of how you could apply this. So in each case, you give the entity a 1 or a 0. The entity as a whole, 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, if it exists at all. And then you give each of the sub-elements a score based on that. And once you've done that, then what you end up with is a very simple, high-level picture of where some of the softness and some of the true productivity exist. Hypothetically, here we see that, by golly, we're doing a good job on strategic planning. Could get better, but it's pretty good. And the concept of structured plans and formal closure is not bad, but gee whiz, the business requirements part of this is just not where it needs to be. So with that in mind, we would focus our attention on that. All right, so that wraps up the role of the BA. Let's take a look at the application now. Now I'm going to show you what could probably be called an eye chart here in slide view mode, but I'm going to momentarily go to the native application view so you can get a better idea. But what this basically conveys is an 11-stage project life cycle. It's bigger than PMIs, and it's a little bigger than the traditional SDLC, software development life cycle, because in a moment you'll see why. But among other things, what it does is first it divides the project or program into 11 stages. Then it talks about key roles, and it also highlights the idea of the business analyst as a key element in those roles. It also then goes into the idea of the inputs and outputs at each stage. So what I'm going to do now is go into the more realistic and viewable version of this to show you some of the details, and we'll basically, basically close out with this. So if you take a look at it here are the 11 stages: business mission, vision, goals, and strategy. Then the next 4 are the requirements: business requirements and process, user, functional, and non-functional. Then we go into the solution domain, the analysis, the design, and the construction, followed by the pre-implementation domain of testing, documentation, and training. Now, at each stage of this 11-phase life cycle, you have roles. Some of you may look at this and say, well, why don't you use RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed? And I'll be honest with you, I don't use RACI because I've spent too much of my career in debates or discussions about what the difference between responsible and accountable is, and I found that if we make it a little bit more down to earth, maybe it's easier. So I've come up with people who organize and oversee, traditionally the project manager, approvers and authorizers, traditionally the sponsors, performers and producers, which can be anybody, including the BA, and supporters, which can be anybody in the BA. And although I won't go through this in detail because there's far too much, the one thing I want to emphasize is this: each step of the way through all the 11 stages, the business analyst and the business system analyst have a role to perform. And when we go down into the specifics of all of the different inputs and the outputs, let me make this so it's at least readable here, you'll see that at the beginning, the business mission, vision, goals, and objectives, we have the business case, the cost benefits analysis, and the roadmap of business capabilities. The BA can support that, and that's the exact role that's shown up here. In that particular stage, the business analyst is a supporter. Why? Because based on our understanding of strategic goals and objectives, we can help. We can add the discipline needed in order for senior decision makers to help develop criteria for approval, metrics for progress identification that goes into whether or not the mission, vision, and goals are being achieved. Otherwise, when we go directly from the goals and objectives to the project, we basically build the scope along the way. And I'm sure most of you will agree that one of the most classic and obvious indications of when scope is being built along the way are change orders. When we get a lot of change orders or a lot of test defects, that's a very, very strong indicator that the initial scope and the initial business analysis were not adequately performed, if at all. So again, if you go through these inputs and then the outputs, you see that the role of the BA can be very critical. Here we have the ultimate deliverable for the business analyst. The business requirements document cuts across all of the requirements areas, business, user, functional, and non-functional, and positions the solution developers, whether they're erecting a multi-story building or a sophisticated cloud network, positions them with the wherewithal to identify solutions that go with the needs that will support the strategic objectives. So when we put all of that together, what it gives us is a very, very clear picture of how the business analyst fits in. We create the BRD. And when we create the BRD and hand it over to the project or program manager, they have a wonderful blueprint that they can then operate against. So the enterprise triple constraint positions the business analyst as an important catalyst that transforms the strategic planning, mission, vision, goals, and objectives into actionable scope with all of the insight, the metrics, the clarity, and the precision needed in order for us to be able to embark on a project or a program and everything that goes with it, so that ultimately the operations of the organization is improved in a way that did not exist before. So business analysis is far from being an administrative task, optional, something that someone should do in addition to what they're doing beyond that, their day job, as we always like to say. Business analysis not only deserves but demands the same level of professionalism that executive strategic planning does and that professional project and program management does. So with that, I will pause now if there are any other questions and open it up to the audience, and thank you for your attention. So Ann, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mike. We really do appreciate your insights during this informative session. Before we begin to address the numerous questions that have continued to come in during today's event, I wanted to let the audience know that Strategy Execution will be following up with emails to contain the presentation slides, valuable thought leadership, and details surrounding upcoming webinar events. We look forward to the opportunity to continue the discussion as to how we can provide performance solutions that transform the way that individuals and organizations think, lead, execute, and perform project-based work. So Tracy, why don't we go ahead and jump into some of the other questions?
And thank you. And Mike, what an excellent presentation today. We do have a lot of questions, and for those that are still waiting, you can use the question box to send your questions to us. Mike, I have a question from Jim, and I'm sure you've heard this many times. I'm going to try and paraphrase it for you. How would you take an organization that is immature with project management and Gantt charts and a small IT department and try and change it where you can actually have BA techniques and eventually a BA working within your company?
Well, this is not an uncommon situation, and one that I face from time to time. And the way I typically recommend proposing it is, first of all, to get support for the concept initially from the top decision makers. If it's a very small company, that may just be one person or at least a couple of people. But to be honest with you, and I'm going to go back to this slide here, making a presentation like this, or at least a subset of this, to emphasize that going from ideas into implementation is just very, very heavily burdened with risk. And risk is simply a synonym for uncertainty. You start out with a great idea, and if it's truly brand new, it's almost pure uncertainty. The only way to translate that uncertainty into something that has a low enough risk to support with people and funding is to embark on the business analysis. And again, I use the example of going on a vacation. You just wouldn't do it the way I said. We shouldn't run businesses that way. Now, in looking at this slide I'm displaying, you certainly could scare someone in a small company into thinking, well, holy smoke, we have to build a federal government in order to do this. Well, then don't show them that. Just show them the triple constraint with the three elements on the three sides in the center there. But the point is mapping out a conceptual approach and then supporting that with a to-do list. Like, we're going to get better at strategic planning. We're going to have a couple of meetings, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to come up with some goals and objectives. Then we're going to talk about how do we translate goals and objectives, which are balloons high in the sky, into measurable elements that a project or a program manager can try to do something with. And once we have that, can't we really get a project or a program manager who's done this before to come in and tell us, how do you schedule things? How do you manage risk? How do you handle communications and communication planning? How do you assess stakeholders and manage stakeholders? So the concepts that you see here on this slide apply no matter what the size is, but it's like a dosage of vitamins or medicine. I would, and I do, typically start with very small doses. And I'll give you one quick anecdote. I was in a hospital system introducing project management in the surgery department. And one of the clinicians, person who operated the heart and lung machine, and at the end of the day had to take his scrubs off because they were covered with blood, wanted to do a couple of things and said, how could I go about this, Mike? And I said, okay, let's do a to-do list of what needs to be done, and let's talk about some of the things that decision makers may be uncomfortable with. That was really hidden business analysis. We did that step by step by step, and the next thing he said was, you know, I like this to-do list, but is there a better way to do it? And I said, sure, let's use Excel. And what we can do is put this in Excel. After a few weeks, he said, that's kind of clunky. Anything else? And I said, sure, let's use Microsoft Project. And now we can start doing business analysis as part of a work breakdown structure. He loved it. It took months. But when he got done, he got the management of the hospital to approve him doing things that he himself was surprised and thought he would never accomplish. So it's a matter of dosage and scale, but all still built on these fundamental concepts. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Mike. Our next question comes from Brenda. Brenda asks, our group has switched from SMEs and BAs and now they're all POs. How does the BA component fit into the role of the PO?
I'm not sure what a PO is. That's not an acronym that immediately comes to mind.
Brenda, are you able to send us a quick... we have a couple of the product owner in the Agile environment.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So, well, I guess the fundamental question is whether it's truly a title change or whether it's a fundamental discipline change. The fact is that a product owner certainly should be a subject matter expert by function. Whether they're called a SME or not really doesn't matter. The product owner is the one who, by virtue of their knowledge of the organization, the environment, the marketplace, the competition, really is the subject matter expert. Now, that person certainly can contribute to the business analysis function without getting the BA title and should be supported by analysts without the BA title in order to translate what they know at the product ownership level into something more precise and achievable like scope. So I guess my reaction is that the titles, and when I teach this kind of thing to myriad organizations, from government agencies to private multi-billion-dollar corporations to relatively small organizations, sometimes entrepreneurships, I use the label or title that is culturally acceptable, but I try never to abandon the fundamental concept, which is business analysis, as we've stressed here, is absolutely critical. And it really is best done by a professional. Now, that means that if you're being asked, or the product owner is being asked to do business analysis part-time, that's going to be tough, because that means both that will have lower than necessary attention and effort, and their regular job will have lower than necessary attention and effort. So, to summarize, the labels don't mean as much as the discipline that is being conveyed, and the focus on the discipline as being as professional as it can. Because I'm going to go out on a limb here and say the concept of part-time project management, part-time business analysis is very, very risky and very, very likely to head for less than optimal results. I hope that was an answer. That was helpful.
Thank you, Mike. Our next question comes from Michelle. She asked, do you think the BA will eventually garner the same respect as PMs, provided we can illustrate our benefits and value, and regardless of the project approach, or agile or waterfall?
I think it already is. One of the assignments I was fortunate to have was building a center of excellence for business analysis in a major insurance company whose name doesn't matter, but it's a household word. And the reason behind it, it was the first center of excellence they ever had, was because they realized, number one, the importance of business analysis, and number two, the importance of having professional and respected BAs. And I got to tell you, it worked. After 2 years, these BAs, in fact, I was being asked to support organizational activities with BAs that we couldn't provide, and the requester was not really happy about that. They kind of got used to it. So I think the answer is yes, it will. Now, project management has a long history. I tend to think it goes back to the pyramids. So it's kind of hard for the BA discipline to catch up with that real quickly. But I think folks like IIBA have done a handsome job in accelerating that. And as many of you know, even PMI now is focused on a business analysis competency at the project and program level. So my answer is yes. I don't know how long it'll take, but if you didn't get any message from this presentation, you should at least get the message that I am a missionary to do exactly what you're saying. I think business analysis is the flip side of a coin. On the other side is project management. And I'm not aware of any one-sided coins. I think they deserve the same level of professionalism, and I think it'll get there. It's just taking a little time.
Excellent, Mike, and I think I can speak for the entire audience. Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Aladdin. And what is the difference between enterprise architecture and the business architecture?
Well, the business there may not be. It depends on how the terms are used, because sometimes these labels do overlap, or they're just synonyms for each other. The concept of big business architecture is the idea that how we do things in terms of flow of activities and progress within the organization. And that is really at the heart of a lot of analysis in terms of efficiency and in terms of scalability of activities. So that the business architecture is really the structure or the orientation and organization of how a business gets things done, and whether or not that is a logical, productive, and efficient way to do things. So again, I mean, it would probably be helpful for me to know the context or the definitions that are being compared here, but that, in my experience, is a very broad-based definition and I guess explanation of what business architecture is and how it differs.
Thank you, Mike. Our next question comes from Tijan. Would you recommend a BA peaking as an enterprise architect as a peak in his or her career or organization?
Say that again now, just to make sure I get it straight.
Absolutely. Would you recommend a BA peaking as an enterprise architect as the peak of his or her career or organization?
Well, that's kind of a personal decision. I would say this, if I were to answer it personally from my point of view, a business architect will, by definition, not normally become involved in the level of activities that we've talked about here in terms of initiatives. The business architect, in the context of the prior question and answer, will be dealing with how the business works in general, not necessarily how individual projects and programs and portfolios are structured and discharged. So I guess it depends on where the person wants to be. If you like to get your hands dirty by being involved in the deliverables of a project or the outcomes and benefits of a program, then peaking as a business architect in the overall category of business analysis might not satisfy you. But if you prefer the strategic sort of wind in your face that you get in business architecture, then that is definitely a laudable goal, because that will keep you at the very highest levels of the organization, and any efficiencies and productive achievements that you're part of at that level will have the ripple effect, a positive ripple effect throughout the entire enterprise. So I guess that's the way I would characterize it. It kind of depends on preference, but I think the BA peaking as a business architect would necessarily be sort of drifting away from the project and program layers.
Thank you, Mike. Our next question comes from Susan. Mike, can you outline the differences in how a BA would approach their work depending on a waterfall versus agile project? This question is because initially there appeared to be no articulated role for a BA in agile methodology.
Yes, and that's that's kind of one of the unfortunate byproducts of the sort of cultural phenomenon that exploded around Agile and Scrum. In fact, earlier on, less so now, but still out there, is the perception that you really don't need business analysis, or if you do, not much. You really don't need much project management or documentation, and it's kind of unfortunate because nothing could be further from the truth. As I showed in the earlier slide with the multiple triangles showing the difference between waterfall and Agile Scrum, there's no difference in what a BA does in terms of disciplines and skills. The difference is on the size of scope that applies to each iteration or Scrum. So if you're doing a 2, 4, or 6 week iteration or Scrum, you still need to talk to the stakeholders, whether they're the sponsors, the users, the affected parties, and find out their needs. And we still need to do an analysis of what the alternatives are. And we still need to get involved in trying to design tests that make sense. So my strongest message and advice is that any BA who is either transitioning from traditional to iterative, or at least becoming involved in it, not relinquish any of your fundamental basic skills, approaches, and techniques. The major difference is that they will be applied on a much smaller scope level in a much shorter time frame. But if we try to build something, and let's face it, folks, if you owned the Samsung phone with the battery that explodes, I would say that, even though that was an incremental change that perhaps was done in an Agile or Scrum environment, somebody blew it. Somebody did not do the kind of business analysis, even including testing, that would have been necessary to help prevent that. So fundamentally, there's no difference. It's only in scale. It's in size. You don't want to do anything less for Agile and Scrum than you do for traditional waterfall. You just don't do as much of it, because in 2 to 6 weeks, how can you do that much? Keeping in mind, too, one of the beauties of the iterative is that if you are lucky enough to have everybody together, you don't have to go far to interact with stakeholders. You can literally get your business analysis done almost in real time.
Excellent, Mike. And we have time for one more quick question, I hope. Ali asks, oh dear, do you have any tips for a junior BA that is just starting out?
That's the question. Any tips for a junior BA just starting out?
That's correct, Mike.
Yeah, actually, what I would suggest you do is, and I don't get a commission on this, I'd say join the International Institute of Business Analysis, get their business analysis body of knowledge, and start becoming familiar with it for two reasons. To find out what you need now in terms of skills or tools that will help you do your work, but also to get a survey of what the business analysis profession is like and where you might want to go with it. I think if you join the IIBA and get the BABOK, as we call it, Business Analysis Body of Knowledge, it can become a handy way for you to do those two things. Increase your current productivity and decide where you want to go with it in the future, because it really does a good job of outlining all the different elements consistent with what we talked about today.
And Mike, with that, we are out of time. Thank you for such a great presentation, very informative. I would like to thank Mike and the entire audience for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar, and I'd like to thank 2080 Strategy Execution for sponsoring today's event.
And thank you to the audience too. It was enjoyable.
Thank you, Mike. And just a quick reminder to everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few business days. And this concludes today's webinar. Thanks, and have a great day.
You too. Bye.